The Red Sea shimmered under a pale Egyptian sun, its waves whispering softly against the shore of Sharm el-Sheikh. The resort city, usually alive with tourists and laughter, had fallen into an uneasy stillness. The air carried the weight of tension and expectation, the kind that hangs before history changes its course. Inside a guarded compound overlooking the water, men in dark suits and guarded expressions walked briskly between rooms. Reporters murmured into microphones. Cameras flashed. Somewhere within those walls, world leaders, military envoys, and negotiators from both Israel and Hamas gathered under one fragile banner: peace. But this story is not about them. It's about Yara, a 28-year-old Palestinian nurse from Gaza, and David, a 34-year-old Israeli paramedic from Tel Aviv, to strangers who would never have met if not for the cruelty of war and the stubborn endurance of hope. Yara had learned to recognize the sound of an airstrike long before it hit. The seconds between the siren and the explosion were the longest of her life. Moments when she closed her eyes and prayed not to hear the scream that followed. She had spent 6 years working in Al-Shifa hospital, treating victims of both sides of the conflict, soldiers, civilians, children. She had grown numb to the sight of blood, yet every face haunted her. Her younger brother, Khalid, had disappeared 6 months ago when he went to help rescue people trapped under rubble. She still kept his phone beside her bed, dead and cracked, hoping one day it might ring. When she heard about the new peace talks in Egypt, she didn't believe them at first. "We've heard this before," she whispered to an elderly patient. Asterisk, they talk, and we bury. Asterisk, but that night, when she walked home past the wreckage of buildings once filled with life, she saw children playing among the ruins. They laughed, genuinely laughed, chasing a torn plastic bag as if it were a kite. And for the first time in months, Yara allowed herself to imagine what silence might sound like, the kind without fear, hundreds of miles away. In a hospital in Tel Aviv, David adjusted the oxygen mask of an elderly patient. He had spent his entire adult life running toward chaos, bombings, shootings, fires, wherever there was suffering. But lately, he felt something breaking inside him. His younger sister, Rena, had been killed in an attack near a checkpoint 2 years earlier. Since then, every emergency call reminded him of her. Every wail, every red light, every stretcher was a ghost. When his supervisor asked for volunteers to join a humanitarian medical exchange in Egypt, David hesitated. He knew the delegation would include both Israeli and Palestinian. Medics, a symbolic gesture to show cooperation. Of his colleagues dismissed it as a political stunt, but something inside him whispered, "Go." He signed his name. The hotel where the peace talks were being held overlooked a quiet stretch of beach. A temporary medical unit had been set up nearby, not for politicians, but for the journalists, security teams, and hundreds of staff supporting the summit. That's where Yara and David first met. She was treating a young Egyptian volunteer who had fainted from dehydration. David arrived with his medical bag slung across his shoulder, sweat dripping from his temples. "I can take it from here," she said, her accent sharp, but her tone steady. "I'm not here to take," he replied softly, handing her a bottle of water. "Just here to help." Their eyes met, cautious, curious. For a moment, the labels of Israeli and Palestinian faded, leaving only two people who had both seen too much pain to hold hatred easily. Over the next few days, they worked side by side, patching wounds, calming nerves, and pretending not to notice the walls that separated their histories. On the third day of the summit, rumors spread like wildfire. Asterisk, a major announcement is coming. Reporters whispered that Hamas had agreed to a temporary ceasefire if humanitarian aid could reach Gaza immediately. Trump's peace envoy, flanked by Egyptian diplomats, was said to be drafting a historic agreement. Yara overheard the news while tending to a cameraman with heat stroke. Her hands trembled. Could it be real this time? That night, she walked alone to the edge of the water. The sea glowed silver under the moonlight. She thought of Khalid, of how he used to collect seashells along the beach when they were children. Behind her, footsteps crunched on the sand. It was David. Couldn't sleep either? He asked, standing beside her. She shook her head. I keep thinking, if this ends, maybe we can finally stop counting bodies. He looked out at the horizon. Maybe we can start counting sunrises instead. Their silence wasn't awkward. It was fragile, sacred, like a prayer. The next morning, as talks resumed, a thunderous blast shattered the fragile calm. Sirens wailed through the compound. A vehicle near the entrance had exploded, sending smoke and panic across the site. David and Yara ran toward the chaos, before anyone told them to, through smoke and screams. They found injured guards and civilians lying amid debris. Yara pressed her scarf against a man's wound while David performed CPR on another. The two worked like they'd been partners for years, synchronized, wordless. When they finally looked up, they realized one of the injured was a delegate's child, a 10-year-old boy named Omar. Caught in the blast, pulses weak. Yara shouted, "Stay with me, kid." David yelled as they lifted the boy onto a stretcher. For 40 minutes, they fought against death together. Their hands shook, their clothes stained with blood, their eyes burning with sweat and tears. And then the boy coughed. He lived around them. Applause broke out among medics and soldiers who had gathered, witnessing something miraculous. Later, when reporters asked how two people from opposite sides of a war had worked together to save a child, Yara simply said because in that moment he wasn't Israeli or Palestinian. He was just a child. News of their acts spread quickly through the summit. For the first time in months, the headlines carried something other than violence. Israeli and Palestinian medics saved child together amid chaos of peace talks. Inside the conference hall, diplomats who had been locked in political deadlock began to talk differently, softer, humbler. The story of Yara and David reached the top table, reminding leaders why they were there. That afternoon, a ceasefire was announced. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't permanent, but it was real. Humanitarian corridors were too open within hours. As journalists flooded the airwaves, the cameras once again turned toward the two medics. What now? A reporter asked them. Yara smiled faintly. Now, we go home and try to heal. Weeks later, the border crossings opened for aid deliveries. Convoys of trucks rolled into Gaza carrying food, medicine, and blankets. Among the supplies was a handwritten note tucked inside one box of medical equipment. It read, "Asterisk. For Yara, you taught me that saving one life can heal 100 hearts. David." Asterisk, she smiled through tears as she read it aloud to her colleagues. Then she turned over the note and wrote her own message. On the back, before handing it to a driver heading toward, "Israel, greater than asterisk for David, you reminded me that peace begins with the hands that refuse to. Harm, asterisk," and so began their exchange. Letters carried across checkpoints, through soldiers and nurses, through chaos and rebuilding. They wrote about their work, their hopes, their small victories. Neither dared to imagine meeting again, yet both clung to the idea that connection, even one born in war, could survive anything. 1 year later, a medical conference was held in Cairo. Among the attendees were Yara, representing Gaza's humanitarian hospitals, and David, part of Israel's emergency response team. When they saw each other across the lobby, they froze for a moment. Then Yara laughed softly, a sound David hadn't realized he'd missed. "You still carry that medical bag?" she teased. "And you still carry the world on your shoulders," he replied. They sat by the Nile that evening, watching the sun melt into gold. "Do you think peace can really last?" Yara asked quietly. "I think peace isn't something that lasts," David said. "It's something people keep choosing every day." Months later, Yara received a photo from an unfamiliar number. It was of Omar, the boy they had saved, now healthy and smiling. Beneath it, a caption read, "Greater than asterisk, starting school today. Thank you for giving me another chance." Asterisk, she stared at the picture for a long time, then sent it to David. Hours later, he replied, "This is the world we're fighting for." Years passed. Conflicts flared again and faded, like tides. But the story of the two medics, the nurse from Gaza and the paramedic from Tel Aviv, became a quiet legend told in humanitarian circles. Classrooms. In peace-building seminars, it was said that when the first joint Israeli-Palestinian medical team crossed the Rafah border to deliver vaccines, they named their mission *** the bridge. *** Yara and David were there, side by side, older now, but unbroken. Cameras flashed as they held the same stretcher, carrying medicine instead of wounded bodies. "This isn't politics," Yara told a journalist that day. "This is humanity reminding itself what it's capable of." And as they crossed that narrow stretch of land, once divided by blood and hatred, the crowd erupted in applause. The sea breeze carried the echoes of their footsteps to people who had chosen compassion over conflict, healing over revenge, and hope over despair. Peace did not come overnight. It never does. But sometimes it begins in the smallest of places, in the hands that choose to save rather than strike, in the hearts that dare to forgive before being asked, in a world that had grown weary of war. Yara and David's story became more than news. It became a reminder that behind every headline, there are people. And behind every conflict, there's still a chance for kindness to win. So the next time someone says peace is impossible, remember the nurse and the paramedic who met at the edge of a war and built a bridge instead of a wall? Because sometimes, the greatest peace plans aren't written on paper. They're written in the courage of ordinary hearts.